The blood on her hands wasn't hers, but Florence Granger knew she'd hang for it anyway if anyone found her crouched behind the water trough in San Elizario, Texas, with a dead man lying 20 feet away in the dusty street. It was August of 1873, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small border town. Florence pressed herself tighter against the rough wooden planks, her breath coming in short gasps. She hadn't killed him. She'd been walking past the saloon when the shots rang out, and she'd run toward the commotion like a fool instead of away from it. The man had stumbled into her arms, bleeding from his chest, and then he died right there while she held him, his blood soaking into her already threadbare dress. She heard boots on the wooden boardwalk, heavy and purposeful. The marshal would be coming soon, and nobody in this town knew her or cared to. She'd arrived on the morning stage, carrying nothing but a small carpet bag and the weight of 22 years of being utterly invisible to everyone who'd ever claimed to care about her. Her aunt had died 3 weeks ago back in St. Louis, and Florence had discovered that the woman hadn't even mentioned her in the will. The boarding house where she'd worked had let her go the same day. She'd had enough money for a stage ticket west, and the vague hope that Texas might offer something better than what she was leaving behind. Now she was going to die here, probably hanged for a murder she didn't commit, and she thought bitterly that at least someone would notice her then, even if it was just long enough to watch her drop from a rope. You might want to move before they find you like that. The voice was low and quiet, coming from directly above her. Florence jerked her head up and found herself looking at a man who seemed to block out the sun. He was crouched on top of the water trough, balanced there with an easy grace that shouldn't have been possible for someone his size. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt and arms corded with muscle. His hair was dark and hung past his collar, and his face was weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a startling pale blue, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "I know. I saw the whole thing from the livery." He jerked his head toward the building across the street. "Shooter went out the back. You just happened to be in the wrong place." He extended a hand down to her. "But the marshal won't care about that. He needs someone to blame, and a stranger covered in blood makes an easy target." Florence stared at his hand. It was broad and scarred, the hand of someone who'd worked hard his entire life. "Why would you help me?" Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to read. "Maybe I don't like seeing innocent people hang. You coming or not?" The sound of voices grew louder. Florence grabbed his hand, and he pulled her up with such easy strength that she felt weightless for a moment. He dropped down from the trough on the opposite side, landing without a sound, and kept hold of her hand as he led her quickly between buildings. They moved through a maze of back alleys and around behind the church, and then they were at the edge of town where the desert stretched out in all directions, shimmering with heat. A massive horse stood waiting, the biggest animal Florence had ever seen. It was a dark bay with a white star on its forehead, and it didn't even shift when the man lifted her up onto its back, as though she weighed nothing at all. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, and then they were moving at a steady lope that carried them away from San Elizario and into the wilderness beyond. Florence's mind reeled. Everything had happened so fast. "Wait," she said. "I don't even know your name." "Where are we going?" "Xander Wilder," he said. His voice rumbled through his chest and she could feel it against her back. "And we're going somewhere they won't find you until things cool down. But I didn't do anything wrong. Doesn't matter. Not many people care about right and wrong out here, just about what's convenient." His arms tightened slightly around her as they navigated down an embankment. You got family waiting for you in San Elizario. No, I don't have family anywhere. The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. He was quiet for a long moment. Well then, nothing to go back for. They rode for hours as the sun moved across the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. Florence had never been outside a city before, and the vastness of the landscape both terrified and awed her. There was nothing for miles in any direction except scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, and the mountains in the distance seemed to shimmer like a mirage. "Where do you live?" she finally asked. "In the Franklins. Got a cabin up in the high country." "Is that far?" "Far enough that nobody bothers me." There was satisfaction in his voice. "We'll camp tonight and get there tomorrow afternoon." As the sun began to set, Xander guided the horse toward a cluster of rocks that formed a natural shelter. He dismounted first, then reached up and lifted Florence down. His hands spanned her waist completely, and she was struck again by the sheer size and strength of him. She'd never been around a man like this before, someone who seemed more a part of the wild landscape than civilization. He worked efficiently, unsaddling the horse and setting up a small camp. He didn't talk much, but Florence found herself watching him, fascinated by the competent way he moved. He gathered deadwood and started a fire, then pulled supplies from his saddlebags and began preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a flat rock near the fire. "You look like you're about to fall over." Florence realized she was swaying on her feet. The shock of the day was catching up with her, and she hadn't eaten since the morning. She sank onto the rock gratefully, and a few minutes later Xander handed her a tin plate of food and a cup of coffee so strong it made her eyes water. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of this. You didn't have to help me." He settled onto the ground across from her, his own plate balanced on his knee. "Couldn't just leave you there. Most people would have. I'm not most people." He looked at her over the fire, his blue eyes reflecting the flames. "What's your name anyway, Florence Granger?" "Florence." He said it slowly as though testing the feel of it. Pretty name. No one had ever said that to her before. She ducked her head, suddenly self-conscious. "It's old-fashioned. Nothing wrong with that." He ate in silence for a moment, then asked, "What were you planning to do in San Elizario?" "I was going to look for work. I can cook and clean, and I'm good with numbers. I thought maybe one of the businesses would hire me." She stared down at her plate. "I know it was foolish. I didn't really have a plan." "Why Texas?" Florence hesitated. The truth felt too pathetic to speak aloud, but something about this man made her want to be honest. "I wanted to go somewhere no one knew me, somewhere I could start over and maybe matter to someone." She laughed without humor. "Instead, I'm running from the law." "You matter," Xander said quietly. "Everyone matters to someone. Not me. My parents died when I was small. My aunt raised me, but she never wanted me. I was just an obligation to her. When she died, she left everything to the church. She didn't even mention me in her will, like I'd never existed at all." Florence's throat tightened. "I spent 5 years working at a boarding house, and when I left, not a single person said goodbye or asked where I was going. It was like I was invisible." The fire crackled between them. Xander set his plate aside and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You're not invisible, Florence. I see you." The words hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at him, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You don't even know me. I know you stopped to help a dying man instead of running. I know you're scared but trying to be brave. I know you've been hurt by people who should have treated you better." He paused. "That's enough for now." Florence felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen and numb for as long as she could remember. Tears stung her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her with such focused attention, as though she was the only person in the world who mattered. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered. Xander was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't matter to anyone. I know what it does to you, how it makes you hollow inside." He picked up a stick and poked at the fire. "I spent 10 years in the mountains alone, trapping and hunting, and I told myself I liked it that way. No one to disappoint, no one to leave. But loneliness is a special kind of poison. It gets into your bones. Why did you leave the mountains?" "Needed supplies. I come down a few times a year to trade pelts and stock up." He glanced at her. "I was planning to head back today when I saw what happened in town. I'm sorry I messed up your plans. Don't be. Maybe it was meant to happen this way." He stood and moved around the fire, settling onto the rock beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, and it made her aware of how cold the desert night had become. "You're shivering." "I'm fine." Without a word, Xander shrugged out of his buckskin jacket and draped it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body and smelled of leather and pine smoke, and something wild she couldn't quite name. The jacket was so large on her it felt like being wrapped in a blanket, and she pulled it close, grateful for the warmth. "Thank you," she said again. The words felt inadequate for everything he'd done for her in the past few hours. "You already thanked me, don't need to keep doing it." But his voice was gentle. "You should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." He spread out bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, giving her privacy and space. Florence lay down on the blankets, still wrapped in his jacket, and stared up at the stars. There were more of them than she'd ever imagined possible, a river of light across the black sky. The desert night was filled with strange sounds, the skitter of small creatures and the distant howl of a coyote. But somehow she felt safe. Across the fire, she heard Xander settling into his own bedroll. She closed her eyes, exhausted but too keyed up to sleep. Her mind kept replaying the events of the day, the blood and the fear and the impossible kindness of this stranger who'd risked himself to save her, Florence. His voice drifted through the darkness, low and quiet. "Yes, you matter. I want you to know that. You matter to me." Her eyes flew open and her heart stuttered in her chest. She couldn't see him through the fire, but she could feel the weight of those words settling over her like a benediction. For the first time in her life, she thought maybe it was true. Maybe she did matter to someone. "Thank you, Xander," she whispered. She heard him shift, and then his voice came again, softer now. "Sleep well, Florence." And somehow, despite everything, she did. They set out at dawn, and Florence learned what it meant to travel through true wilderness. The desert gave way gradually to foothills, and the foothills rose into mountains covered with pine and juniper. The air grew thinner and cooler, and Florence found herself breathing hard as the horse climbed steadily upward along narrow trails that seemed to have been made by animals rather than men. Xander guided the horse with easy confidence, and Florence tried not to think about the sheer drops on either side of the path. He seemed to sense her nervousness because his arms tightened around her slightly, a silent reassurance. "How much farther?" she asked. "Couple more hours." "The cabin's in a valley on the far side of this ridge. Do you ever get lonely up here by yourself?" "Sometimes, but I prefer it to the alternative." He paused. "People are difficult. They want things from you, expect things. Out here, it's simpler." "What made you come to the mountains in the first place?" She felt him tense behind her. "That's a long story. We have a couple more hours." He was silent for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I grew up in Kansas. My parents had a farm and I was the youngest of 4 boys. When I was 20, there was a drought. Crops failed and my father took a loan from a banker in town. When we couldn't pay it back, the bank took the farm." His voice was flat, emotionless. My father hanged himself in the barn. My mother died 6 months later. Doctors said it was her heart, but I think she just gave up. Xander, I'm so sorry. My older brothers scattered. We'd never been close, and after that, there was nothing holding us together. I drifted for a while, doing odd jobs, getting into fights. I was angry all the time, angry at the world and God and everything else. Then one day I got into a fight with a man who pulled a knife on me. I beat him so badly he almost died. He exhaled slowly. That scared me, how much I'd wanted to hurt him. So I came out here, as far from people as I could get, and I've been here ever since. Florence absorbed this, understanding him better now. How long has it been? 10 years this fall. And you've been alone that whole time, mostly. Sometimes I'll run into other trappers or hunters, but I don't seek them out. His voice softened. It's been a long time since I've talked this much to anyone. They crested the ridge, and Florence gasped. Spread out below them was a high mountain valley, green and lush compared to the desert below. A stream cut through the center, its water flashing silver in the sunlight, and pine trees clustered thick on the slopes. Nestled at the base of a cliff was a small log cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's home." There was pride in his voice. "I built that cabin with my own hands. Took me 3 months, but it's solid. Keeps out the wind and the snow. It snows here, starts in November usually. Won't stop until April or May." He urged the horse forward down the trail into the valley. "You'll need warmer clothes before then." The casual way he said it, as though he'd assumed she'd still be here come winter, made Florence's heart skip. "Xander, I can't just stay with you. It's not proper. You got somewhere else to go." "Well, no, but then you'll stay." His tone brooked no argument. "At least until spring, when it's safe to go back down to town. By then, whoever actually killed that man will probably have been caught, or at least people will have forgotten about it." They reached the cabin, and Xander dismounted before lifting Florence down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly. He caught her easily, steadying her until she found her balance. "Thank you," she said automatically, then caught herself. "Sorry. I know you said I don't need to keep thanking you. It's all right." His hands lingered on her arms for just a moment before he released her. "Come on. I'll show you inside." The cabin was a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end and a narrow loft accessible by a ladder at the other. It was sparse but surprisingly tidy, with a rough-hewn table and chairs, an iron cookstove, and shelves lined with supplies. Furs and hides hung from the rafters, and there was a narrow bed against one wall. "It's not much," Xander said, watching her face, "but it's warm and dry. It's wonderful." And she meant it. The cabin felt solid and safe, a refuge from the world. "Where will I sleep? You can have the bed. I'll take the loft. I can't take your bed, Florence." He turned to look at her, and his expression was serious. "I brought you here. You're under my protection now. That means you get the bed, you get the warmth of the fire, and you get whatever else you need. Understood?" Something in his voice made her nod mutely. This was a man who meant what he said, who would protect what he considered his. And apparently, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, he decided she was worth protecting. Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Xander spent his mornings checking his trap lines and hunting, while Florence explored the cabin and its surroundings. She'd never been much of a cook, but the basic supplies in the cabin were familiar enough that she managed to prepare simple meals. She cleaned and organized, mended a tear in one of Xander's shirts, and generally tried to make herself useful. He seemed surprised by this, as though he'd expected her to be helpless or demanding. But Florence had spent too many years working at the boarding house to be useless with domestic tasks, and she found a strange satisfaction in caring for the cabin and for Xander. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Xander proved to be a good storyteller when he warmed up, sharing tales of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and mountain lions, of brutal winters when the snow drifted higher than the cabin roof. Florence told him about her life in St. Louis, the endless sameness of her days at the boarding house, the small kindnesses from guests that she'd hoarded like treasures. "Did you ever think about leaving before your aunt died?" Xander asked one evening. "All the time, but I never had the courage." Florence poked at the fire with a stick. "I was afraid that if I left, I'd end up with nothing. At least at the boarding house I had a place to sleep and food to eat. But you weren't living, you were just surviving." "I suppose so." She looked at him. "Is that what you've been doing up here?" "Surviving," he considered the question seriously. "Maybe. I told myself I was living free, but mostly I was just hiding." His eyes met hers across the flames. "Until now. What's different now? You're here." He said it simply, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I like having you here, Florence. I like coming back to the cabin and knowing you'll be waiting. I like hearing your voice and watching the way you frown when you're concentrating on something. You make this place feel less empty." Florence's cheeks flushed, and her heart hammered in her chest. "I like being here too. I like the quiet and the mountains," and she hesitated, then forced herself to continue. "And I like you. You make me feel safe." Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that was both exciting and terrifying. Xander stood and moved around the fire to sit beside her on the bench. This close, she could see the details of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor implied. "Florence," he said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I'm not a gentle man. I've lived rough for a long time and I've done things I'm not proud of, but I swear to you I will never hurt you. You're safe with me, always." "I know." And she did. Despite knowing him for only a few days, she trusted him in a way she'd never trusted anyone. "I want you to stay, not just until spring, but for good." He reached out and took her hand, his large one engulfing hers completely. "I know it's fast, and I know I'm not offering you much. But I'll take care of you, Florence. You'll never have to feel invisible again." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I've never had anyone want me before. I want you." His voice was fierce. "I want you here with me. I want to wake up knowing you're in this cabin. I want to come home to you every night. I want—" He broke off and cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I want to matter to you the way you matter to me." "You do," she whispered. "You already do." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But Florence didn't want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the future he was offering even though it terrified her. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and careful, as though he was afraid she might break. She leaned into the kiss, and his arms came around her, pulling her close against his broad chest. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Xander rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Say you'll stay." "I'll stay." He exhaled, and she felt the tension drain from his body. "Thank you." That night, as Florence lay in the narrow bed and listened to Xander moving around in the loft above, she felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt wanted. She felt cherished. She felt like she mattered. And then, just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard his voice drift down from the loft, so quiet she almost missed it. "You matter, Florence. You matter to me." She smiled into the darkness, her heart full to bursting. "You matter to me too, Xander." The days that followed were some of the happiest Florence had ever known. She and Xander worked side by side, falling into an easy partnership. She learned how to cure the hides he brought back from his trap lines, how to recognize which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to shoot the rifle he insisted she learn to use for protection when he was away. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel stupid when she struggled with something. And he seemed to take genuine pleasure in her successes, like the day she finally managed to hit the target he'd set up, or when she successfully tanned her first hide without ruining it. But it was the evenings that Florence treasured most. After the work was done and they'd eaten supper, they would sit together and talk. Xander told her more about his family, the good memories mixed with the painful ones. She learned that he'd loved his mother deeply, that he still felt guilty for not being able to save his father, that his brothers had blamed him unfairly for the family's dissolution. In turn, Florence opened up about her own past. She told him about her parents, the vague memories she had of feeling loved and secure before the fever took them both. She told him about her aunt's coldness, the way the woman had made it clear that Florence was a burden and an inconvenience. She told him about the years of feeling like she was taking up space she hadn't earned, of trying so hard to be good and useful and quiet so no one would regret keeping her around. She was wrong, Xander said fiercely when Florence finished. Your aunt was wrong about you. You're not a burden. You're a gift. Florence had cried then, and Xander had held her while she wept for all the years she'd spent believing she was unwanted. He stroked her hair and murmured comforting words, and when the tears finally stopped, he tilted her face up to his and kissed her with such tenderness that she started crying all over again, but this time from happiness. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened. They still hadn't consummated their union, both of them dancing around the topic with an almost old-fashioned courtesy. But the affection between them was obvious in small touches and lingering glances. Xander would brush his hand across the small of her back as he passed her. Florence would straighten his collar or smooth his hair back from his face. They would sit close together in the evenings, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. And every night without fail, after Florence had climbed into bed and Xander had ascended to the loft, he would call down softly, "You matter, Florence. You matter to me." And every night her heart would swell with love and gratitude, and she would whisper back, "You matter to me too, Xander." One morning in early September, Florence woke to find the cabin unusually cold. She wrapped a blanket around herself and went to the door, gasping when she opened it. The valley was dusted with snow, the first of the season. It was just a light covering, not the deep drifts Xander had warned her about, but it transformed the landscape into something magical and otherworldly. "First snow," Xander said from behind her. She turned to find him descending the ladder from the loft, already dressed for the day. "It'll melt by this afternoon, but it's a warning. Winter's coming. How bad will it get? Bad enough that we'll be trapped here for months. No going down the mountain until spring." He came to stand beside her in the doorway, looking out at the white landscape. "Are you sure you want to stay? Once the heavy snows start, there's no changing your mind." Florence looked up at him. His hair was tousled from sleep, and there was concern in his blue eyes. She realized that he was genuinely worried she might leave, that he was giving her an out if she wanted one. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I want to be here with you, Xander. I don't care about the snow or being trapped. This is where I want to be." Relief flooded his face and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I was afraid you'd want to leave." "Never." She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his chest. Through the fabric of his shirt she could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady. "This is the first place I've ever felt at home. You're the first person I've ever loved." He went very still. "You love me." Florence realized what she'd said and panic fluttered in her chest. It was too soon, wasn't it? They'd only known each other for a few weeks, but when she looked up at him, she saw wonder in his face, not rejection. "Yes," she said simply. "I love you, Florence." He cupped her face in his hands, his expression reverent. "I love you too. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you behind that water trough, scared and brave at the same time. You matter to me more than anyone ever has. You matter to me more than my own life." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Florence felt heat bloom through her entire body. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Marry me," Xander said urgently. "I know there's no preacher up here, but marry me anyway. Say you'll be my wife." "Yes," Florence said, laughing through tears of joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." They stood in the doorway and made their vows to each other, simple promises spoken with complete sincerity. Xander promised to love and protect her, to make sure she never felt invisible or unwanted again. Florence promised to stand beside him, to make this cabin a home, to love him for as long as she lived. When they finished, Xander kissed her again, and then he swept her up in his arms and carried her back inside the cabin. He kicked the door shut behind them, and for the first time since they'd met, there was clear intent in his actions. "Are you sure?" he asked, even as he carried her toward the bed. "I don't want to rush you. I'm sure." Florence's heart was racing, but it was from excitement, not fear. "I want this. I want you." He laid her down on the bed with such gentleness it made her chest ache. What followed was sweet and passionate, Xander taking his time to learn every inch of her body, to show her pleasures she'd never imagined. He was tender and careful, always making sure she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. And when they finally joined together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two people who'd been lonely for so long finally finding their home in each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Florence's head pillowed on Xander's broad chest. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she could feel the rumble of his voice when he spoke. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "I'd convinced myself I didn't want it. But God, Florence, I want this. I want you. I want to spend every day of the rest of my life showing you how much you matter." "You already do," she murmured, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Every day in 100 small ways. You make me feel valued and cherished. You make me feel like I'm worth something. You are worth something. You're worth everything." He tilted her face up and kissed her softly. "You're my wife now in every way that counts, mine to love and protect, mine to cherish. And you're my husband, mine to care for, mine to love." They made love again, slower this time, learning each other's bodies and preferences. And when they finally emerged from the cabin in the late afternoon, the snow had indeed melted, but something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer two separate people sharing a space. They were a unit, a partnership, a marriage. The weeks leading up to deep winter were busy ones. Xander worked from dawn to dusk preparing for the months ahead, hunting and preserving meat, gathering firewood, checking and reinforcing the cabin against the cold. Florence worked alongside him, learning the skills she'd need to survive in this harsh environment. She learned how to render fat for candles and soap, how to make jerky that would keep for months, how to store root vegetables so they wouldn't freeze. They worked hard, but they also found joy in the work. Xander would make her laugh with stories or by sneaking up behind her to steal a kiss. Florence would sing while she worked, old songs from her childhood, and she'd catch Xander stopping to listen with a soft expression on his face. In the evenings, exhausted but content, they would fall into bed together and make love with a passion that never seemed to diminish. And every single night, just before Florence drifted off to sleep in Xander's arms, he would whisper against her hair, "You matter, Florence. You matter to me." And she would whisper back, "You matter to me too, my love." The first heavy snow came in mid-November, and it was everything Xander had warned her about. It started as fat, gentle flakes that Florence thought were beautiful. But within hours the wind picked up, and the snow came down so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet past the cabin windows. It snowed for 3 days straight, and when it finally stopped, the drifts were higher than Florence's head. But the cabin was warm and well-stocked, and Florence found she didn't mind being snowbound. If anything, she relished it. The outside world couldn't reach them here. There was no one to judge or criticize, no one to make her feel small or unwanted. There was just her and Xander, building a life together in their mountain sanctuary. They settled into winter routines. Xander would go out each day to check on the horse in its shelter and bring in more firewood. Florence would cook and clean and work on the sewing projects she'd started, making warmer clothes for both of them from the furs and hides Xander had collected. In the afternoons, they would often curl up together by the fire and read. Xander had a small collection of books, mostly adventure novels and technical manuals, and they took turns reading aloud to each other. Florence loved listening to Xander read. His deep voice gave the words weight and meaning, and she could listen to him for hours. Sometimes she would fall asleep to the sound of his voice, safe and warm in his arms, and she would think that she'd never been so content in her entire life. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly. Xander had trapped a turkey, and Florence roasted it with wild onions and herbs. She'd made him a new shirt from deerskin, spending weeks on the intricate beadwork around the collar and cuffs. When he opened it on Christmas morning, his eyes had gone suspiciously bright. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the beadwork. "Florence, this must have taken you forever. I wanted to make you something special, something that showed how much I love you." He'd pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "I love you too, more than I can say." His gift to her was equally thoughtful. He'd carved her a set of hair combs from elk antler, polishing them until they gleamed. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each comb decorated with tiny carved flowers. Florence cried when she opened them, overwhelmed by the time and care he'd put into making something beautiful just for her. They made love in front of the fire that night, slow and sweet, and Florence thought that this was what happiness felt like. This bone-deep contentment, this certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Winter deepened, and the snow continued to fall. There were days when the wind howled around the cabin with such fury that Florence was grateful for the solid walls and tight chinking Xander had put in. There were nights when the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire. But through it all, they were together. They talked about their future, making plans for the spring. Xander wanted to expand the cabin, adding another room and a proper loft bedroom. Florence wanted to start a garden, growing vegetables and herbs to supplement their stores. They talked about having children someday, about the life they would build together in this mountain valley. "You ever miss civilization?" Florence asked one evening. They were in bed, wrapped in layers of blankets and furs, with Xander's body heat keeping her warm. "The conveniences and the people and all of that. No," he said without hesitation. "I have everything I need right here. I have you. But don't you want more? Don't you want to be part of the world again?" "I am part of the world. This is my world." He pulled her closer, his arms tight around her. "Florence, I spent years being angry and bitter and alone. I thought I was happy, but I was just numb. You changed that. You made me feel again. You made me want to live again, not just survive. Why would I want to go back to a world that never gave me anything but pain when I have paradise right here?" Florence understood what he meant. She'd spent her whole life feeling like an outsider looking in, never quite belonging anywhere. But here in this cabin in Xander's arms, she finally felt like she'd come home. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too." He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then her lips. You matter to me, Florence. You'll always matter to me. January brought the worst of the winter storms. There were days when they didn't leave the cabin at all, when even opening the door would let in a blast of cold that stole the breath from their lungs. They would huddle close to the fire, conserving their energy and their supplies, and wait for the storm to pass. It was during one of these storms that Florence started feeling ill. At first, she thought it was just the close quarters and the heavy food they'd been eating, but as the days passed, she realized it was something else. Her breasts were tender, and the smell of the salt pork they'd been eating for breakfast made her nauseous. She was pregnant. Florence sat with the knowledge for several days, trying to decide how she felt about it. She was scared, certainly. She'd never been around babies or children much, and the idea of giving birth in a remote mountain cabin with no doctor terrified her. But underneath, the fear was a thread of pure joy. She was going to have a baby. Xander's baby. They were going to be a real family. She told him one evening after supper. He was sitting by the fire, mending a harness, and she perched on the arm of his chair. "Xander, I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, hearing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Better than fine, actually." She took his hand and placed it on her still, flat stomach. "I'm pregnant." He went completely still, his eyes locked on where his hand rested against her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." For a long moment, he didn't move or speak. Then suddenly he was on his feet, lifting her up and spinning her around, laughing with pure delight. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Florence, we're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" She asked, though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy? I'm beyond happy. He broke off and cupped her face in his hands. "You've given me everything. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. I don't deserve you, but I swear I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," Florence said, crying now. "You already are, my love." That night, Xander was even more tender with her than usual, treating her as though she was made of glass. He made love to her with such reverence that Florence felt worshipped, cherished in a way she'd never dreamed possible. And when they were done, as they lay tangled together in the afterglow, he placed his hand over her stomach and spoke to the baby growing inside her. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I'm your father. I want you to know that you're already loved more than you can imagine. Your mother and I are going to give you everything we didn't have growing up. You're going to know every day of your life that you matter, that you're wanted, that you're the best thing that ever happened to us." Florence cried silently, overwhelmed by the love in his voice. And then Xander turned to her, his expression fierce. "You matter, Florence," he said. "You matter to me more than my own life. You and this baby are my whole world now. And you're ours," she whispered back. "You're our whole world, too." The rest of the winter passed in a blur of preparation. Xander became even more protective, insisting that Florence rest more and take on only the lightest tasks. He took over most of the cooking and cleaning, and he started working on a cradle, carving it from pine and polishing it until it was smooth as silk. Florence spent her time sewing baby clothes from soft scraps of fabric and fur, creating tiny garments that would keep their child warm in the harsh mountain climate. She would sit by the fire, her hands busy with her sewing, and daydream about their baby. Would it be a boy or a girl? Would it have Xander's blue eyes or her brown ones? Would it be healthy and strong? The fears that had gripped her initially faded as the weeks passed. Yes, childbirth was dangerous, and yes, they were isolated. But Xander had helped deliver calves and foals before, and he'd been reading and rereading the medical manual he'd found at a trading post years ago. They would manage. They would have to. Spring came late that year, with snow lingering well into April. But finally, the days began to warm and the snow started to melt. The stream roared with runoff, and green shoots began to push up through the wet ground. Florence, now noticeably pregnant, stood in the doorway of the cabin and breathed in the fresh mountain air, grateful to be able to move around more freely again. "What do you think?" Xander asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her, his hands resting on her rounded belly. "Should we go down to town once the trail's clear? Get proper supplies for the baby?" Florence leaned back against him, considering. "Do you think it's safe? For me, I mean. Will anyone still be looking for me about what happened last year? I doubt it. And if they are, I'll protect you. No one is going to take you from me." The fierceness in his voice made her smile. "Then yes, let's go. I'd like to get some proper fabric for baby clothes and maybe some other supplies." They made the trip in early May, when Florence was about 6 months along and still mobile enough for the journey. Xander had fashioned a more comfortable saddle arrangement for her, and they took their time on the trail, stopping often to rest. San Elizario had changed little in the months they'd been gone. It was still a dusty border town, still filled with rough men and rougher business. But no one seemed to remember or care about the shooting from the previous summer. Florence kept her head down anyway, staying close to Xander's side as they visited the general store and the trading post. The shopkeeper's wife, a kindly woman named Mrs. Henderson, was delighted to help Florence select supplies for the baby. She clucked over Florence's pregnancy, offering advice and well wishes, and she threw in a soft baby blanket as a gift. "You're a lucky woman," she said, glancing at Xander, who was examining tools at the other end of the store. "That's a good man you've got there. I can tell by the way he watches you, like you're the most precious thing in the world." Florence followed her gaze to find Xander looking at her with such open adoration that her breath caught. "I am lucky," she agreed softly. "He's the best thing that ever happened to me." They stayed in town only long enough to complete their business, then headed back up the mountain. Florence was relieved to see the cabin again, to be back in their sanctuary away from the world. Town had been interesting, but it had also reminded her of why she preferred their isolated life. Up here, it was just the two of them and the baby they were waiting for. Up here, she was safe and loved and wanted. Summer arrived, bringing with it long, golden days and warm nights. Florence's belly continued to grow, and she felt the baby moving inside her more and more frequently. Xander loved to place his hands on her stomach and feel the kicks and rolls, his face lighting up with wonder every time. He also became increasingly anxious as her due date approached. He checked and rechecked their supplies, making sure they had everything they might need. He read the medical manual so many times he could probably recite it from memory. And he barely let Florence out of his sight, hovering protectively and insisting she rest frequently. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she teased one afternoon when he'd made her sit down for the 3rd time in an hour. "I know, but I can't help it. I'm terrified something will go wrong." He knelt beside her chair and took her hand. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you, Florence. You're my whole life." She cupped his face, feeling the rasp of his beard against her palm. "Nothing is going to happen to me. Women have been giving birth since the beginning of time. We'll be fine. Promise me." "I promise." But despite her reassurances, Florence was scared too. As her due date grew closer, she found herself lying awake at night, one hand on her belly, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in. "Please let the baby be healthy. Please let me be strong enough. Please don't let me leave Xander alone." And every night, without fail, Xander would pull her close and whisper in her ear, "You matter, Florence. You matter to me. You're going to be fine. We're going to be fine." The baby came in late August, during a thunderstorm that shook the cabin walls. Florence's labor started in the early morning hours, a dull ache in her back that gradually intensified. By noon, the contractions were coming strong and regular, and by evening she was in the grip of pain unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Xander stayed with her through it all, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her when she wanted to give up. He was calm and steady, even though she could see the fear in his eyes. He'd boiled water and laid out clean cloths and followed all the instructions from the medical manual. And now, all they could do was wait for nature to take its course. It took hours, long, painful hours that seemed to stretch into eternity. But finally, just as the storm began to clear, Florence felt the overwhelming urge to push. She bore down with everything she had, squeezing Xander's hand so hard she thought she might break it. And then, suddenly, blessedly, it was over. There was a moment of silence, and then a thin, reedy cry filled the cabin. "It's a boy," Xander said, his voice choked with emotion. "Florence, we have a son." He placed the baby on her chest, and Florence looked down at the tiny, squalling creature who was still covered in blood and vernix. He was perfect. 10 tiny fingers and 10 tiny toes, a shock of dark hair and eyes that were already trying to focus on her face. She felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama." Xander wrapped his arms around both of them, and Florence looked up to see that he was crying too. "We did it," he said. "We have a son, Florence. What should we name him?" They discussed names but never settled on anything. Now, looking at his tiny face, Florence knew exactly what his name should be. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Wilder, after your father." Xander's face crumpled and he buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red but shining with joy. "Thomas," he repeated. "Yes, that's perfect." The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. But they were also filled with moments of perfect joy. The first time Thomas smiled at them, the way he would grip Xander's finger with his tiny fist, the soft sounds he made while nursing. Xander was a devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried, singing softly to him in a voice that was surprisingly melodic. And every night, after Thomas had been fed and changed and put down in his cradle, Xander would lean over and whisper to him, "You matter, Thomas. You matter to me and to your mother. You're going to grow up knowing you're loved and wanted. You're going to know every day that you're important." And then he would climb into bed with Florence, pull her close, and whisper the words he'd been saying since that first night in the desert. "You matter, Florence. You matter to me." She would whisper back, "You matter to me too, Xander. You and Thomas. You're my whole world." The years passed quickly after that, marked by the turning of seasons and the milestones of their son's growth. Thomas learned to crawl, then to walk, then to run. He learned to talk, his first word Papa, much to Xander's delight. He learned to help around the cabin, to gather eggs from the chickens they'd acquired, to feed the horse, to stack firewood. When Thomas was 3, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter, Emma, was born during a snowstorm the following January, arriving much faster than Thomas had. She came out screaming, all red-faced fury and flailing fists, and Florence fell in love with her immediately. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. He would bring diapers without being asked, would sing to her when she cried, would entertain her with funny faces that made her giggle. "You're a good big brother," Florence told him one afternoon, watching him gently rock Emma's cradle. "She matters," he said seriously, parroting the words he'd heard his father say every night of his life. "Emma matters to me." Florence's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Thomas into a hug. "You matter too, sweetheart. You matter so much." More years passed. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did. Emma grew into a lively, talkative little girl who followed her brother everywhere. Xander expanded the cabin as he'd promised, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. Florence planted her garden and found she had a talent for growing things, even in the harsh mountain climate. They were happy. Not in some perfect fairy tale way, but in the real, messy way of actual life. There were hard times, winters that seemed endless, a summer when the garden failed, the terrifying week when Thomas caught pneumonia and they thought they might lose him. But there were also countless moments of joy and laughter and love. And every single night, without fail, Xander would gather his family close and tell them the words that had become their family creed. "You matter," he would say, looking at each of them in turn. "You matter to me, all of you. You're my whole world." When Florence was 35, Xander 43, they made a trip down to San Elizario with both children. Thomas was now 12, tall and gangly, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's practical nature. Emma was 9, pretty and precocious and utterly fearless. They'd come to town to resupply and to sell the furs Xander had collected over the winter. It was a rare trip. They only came down once or twice a year, and the children found it endlessly exciting. While Xander was at the trading post, Florence took the children to the general store. Mrs. Henderson was still there, much older now but still running the place with an iron fist. She exclaimed over how much the children had grown and insisted on giving them each a piece of candy. "I remember when you first came through here, all those years ago," she said to Florence. "You looked so lost and scared, and now look at you. You've got a beautiful family and a good life." "I do," Florence agreed, watching Thomas and Emma examine the jars of candy with serious concentration. "I'm very lucky." "Not luck," Mrs. Henderson said shrewdly. "That man of yours, he looks at you the same way he did 13 years ago, like you hung the moon. That's not luck, honey, that's love." Florence smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "Yes, that's love." They stayed in town overnight at the small hotel, and the children thought it was a grand adventure. But Florence was relieved when they headed back up the mountain the next day. Town was fine for a visit, but it wasn't home. Home was the cabin in the high valley, where the air was thin and clean and the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the call of eagles. That night, as they lay in bed in the hotel, Xander pulled Florence close. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying with me all those years ago? You could have had a different life, an easier life in town, with neighbors and conveniences." "Never," Florence said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Xander. You gave me a home and a family and the knowledge that I matter to someone." "How could I ever regret that? I love you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God, Florence, I love you so much. You saved me, you know. Before you came along, I was just going through the motions. I was alive but not living. You changed everything." "You saved me too," she whispered. "I was invisible before I met you. I was just taking up space, not really living. You made me feel seen. You made me feel like I mattered. You do matter. You always have." He kissed her long and deep. "You matter, Florence. You matter to me." And even though they weren't alone, even though the children were sleeping in the next room, Florence whispered back the words that had become as natural as breathing. "You matter to me too, Xander. You always will." They returned to their mountain sanctuary and continued their life. Thomas grew into a young man, strong and capable like his father. Emma grew into a lovely young woman, smart and spirited. They both knew the mountains intimately, could track and hunt and survive on their own. But more importantly, they knew they were loved. They knew they mattered. When Thomas was 18, he began making noises about wanting to see more of the world. Xander understood he'd been young once too, but Florence found it hard to let go. Her baby was growing up, ready to leave the nest they'd built for him. "He'll come back," Xander assured her one night after Thomas had gone to bed. "This place is in his blood just like it's in ours. He needs to go and see the world so he'll appreciate what he has here. I know. I just worry. That's what mothers do." He pulled her close and they sat together in front of the fire, watching the flames dance. "Florence, do you realize we've been together for almost 18 years? Has it been that long? 18 years this past August. The best 18 years of my life." He kissed the top of her head. "You know what I remember most about that first night in the desert?" "What?" "The look on your face when I told you that you mattered. It was like no one had ever said that to you before. No one had. Well, I've been making up for lost time ever since." His arms tightened around her. "And I'm going to keep saying it for the rest of our lives. Every night until we're old and gray and our grandchildren are running around this cabin." "I'd like that," Florence said softly. "Growing old with you. You matter, Florence," he whispered. "You matter to me." "You matter to me too, my love. Always." Thomas did leave eventually, heading down to Texas to try his hand at ranching. But he came back every few months to visit, and he always brought stories of his adventures. When he was 23, he brought home a bride, a sweet-faced young woman named Sarah who fell in love with the mountains almost as quickly as she'd fallen in love with Thomas. Emma left too, but not far. She married a young trapper named Daniel who'd been courting her for 2 years, and they built a cabin on the other side of the valley. Florence could see the smoke from their chimney on clear days, and Emma visited often, especially after she had her first baby. Xander and Florence became grandparents, then grandparents again. Their cabin filled with the sound of children's laughter whenever the family came to visit. They grew older, their hair turning gray, their bodies moving a little slower, but the love between them never dimmed. On their 25th anniversary, Xander surprised Florence with a trip down to San Elizario. He'd arranged for them to be married properly by a circuit preacher who was passing through town. They stood in the little church and repeated the vows they'd made to each other so many years ago in the doorway of their cabin, and this time there was a witness and a legal certificate to make it official. "You were already my wife," Xander said afterward as they walked back to the hotel. "But I wanted to make it official. I wanted the world to know you're mine." "I've always been yours," Florence said, linking her arm through his, "from that very first night. And I've been yours." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Florence, I need you to know something. That day in San Elizario when I saw you behind that water trough, I didn't just decide to help you on a whim. I looked at you and something in my chest shifted. I looked at you and I thought, that's her. That's the one. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. You were meant to be mine and I was meant to be yours." Tears streamed down Florence's face. "I felt it too. I was so scared, but then you reached down your hand to me and I knew you were going to change my life." They kissed there in the street. Two middle-aged people who loved each other as deeply as they had as young lovers. And that night, in their hotel room, they made love with the same passion and tenderness they'd always shared, their bodies fitting together as perfectly as they had from the very beginning. The years continued to pass. They celebrated Christmas with their children and grandchildren, the cabin overflowing with family. They worked side by side in the garden, their movements synchronized after so many years together. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, content in each other's company. When Florence was 52, she found a lump in her breast. By the time she told Xander about it, it had grown considerably, and she knew what it meant. She'd heard stories of women who died from such things, had seen the way it ravaged their bodies. Xander wanted to take her to a doctor in El Paso, but Florence refused. "I don't want to spend my last months in a hospital, surrounded by strangers. I want to be here in our home with you." "Don't talk like that," he said fiercely. "You're going to be fine, Xander." She took his face in her hands. "I need you to listen to me. I've had a wonderful life, the best life. You gave me everything I ever dreamed of and so much more. If it ends now, I have no regrets. I can't lose you." His voice broke. "Florence, I can't. You won't lose me, not really. I'll always be with you in your heart and in your memories, and in our children and grandchildren." She kissed him gently. "But I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, I need you to keep living. Don't retreat back into yourself like you did before we met. Stay close to the family. Keep telling them they matter. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," he said, though the words seemed torn from him. But Florence didn't die. Against all odds, the lump began to shrink. Whether it was the herbs the old trapper woman from the next valley brought her, or simply the sheer force of her will to live, no one knew. But by the following spring it was gone, and Florence was healthy again. "You're too stubborn to die," Xander said, holding her tight, relief making his voice shake. "I'm not ready yet," Florence agreed. "We still have more life to live." And they did. Years and years more of it. They watched their grandchildren grow and have children of their own. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, then their 45th, then their 50th. They grew old together, their bodies wearing down but their spirits remaining strong. When Florence was 71, she woke one morning to find Xander already awake beside her, watching her with those blue eyes that had lost none of their intensity over the decades. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, reaching up to touch his face. It was deeply lined now, weathered by 79 years of life, but to her, he was as handsome as he'd been that day in San Elizario. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "I'm thinking about that scared young woman I found behind a water trough almost 50 years ago, and how she became my whole world. I'm thinking about how grateful I am for every single day I've had with you." "I'm the lucky one," Florence said. "You gave me a life I never dreamed was possible. You made me feel like I mattered. You did matter. You do matter." His hand covered hers where it rested on his cheek. "You matter, Florence. You matter to me." She smiled, the same words she'd heard every single night for 50 years still making her heart swell with love. "You matter to me too, Xander. You always have. You always will." They lay there together, hand in hand, as the morning sun painted the mountains gold outside their window. And Florence thought that if this was all there was, if this was the sum total of her life, it was more than enough. She'd been loved. She'd been cherished. She'd mattered to someone. She'd mattered to everyone who counted. Years continued to unfold like the turning pages of a well-loved book. Their family grew larger, spreading out through the mountains and into the towns below. But the core remained the same, centered around the cabin in the high valley where it had all begun. When Florence turned 75, the entire family gathered for a celebration. There were so many of them now that they had to hold the party outside, setting up tables under the pine trees. 3 generations of Wilders filled the valley with laughter and music and love. Thomas, now 53 and a grandfather himself, stood to make a toast. "To my mother," he said, raising his glass. "The strongest, kindest, most loving woman I've ever known. You taught me what it means to be part of a family. You taught me that everyone matters, that everyone deserves to be seen and heard and loved. Everything good in my life comes from the example you set." Emma stood next. tears in her eyes. "Mama, you showed me what love looks like. The way you and Papa have loved each other all these years, it's the standard I've held my own marriage to. You've given us all such a gift." One by one, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood, each sharing what Florence meant to them. She cried through most of it, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from the family she and Xander had built together. When it was finally Xander's turn, he stood slowly, his body stiff with age but his presence still commanding. He looked around at the gathered family, then down at Florence. 52 years ago, he said, his voice carrying across the clearing, I met a young woman who'd been told her whole life that she didn't matter, that she was invisible, that she was nothing more than a burden to be tolerated. He reached down and took Florence's hand, pulling her to her feet beside him. I knew from that first moment that it was a lie. This woman mattered more than anyone I'd ever met. She mattered so much that I built my entire life around her, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. He turned to face her fully, both his hands holding hers now. You matter, Florence. You've always mattered. To me, to our children, to every single person here. You matter because you're kind and strong and loving. You matter because you make the world a better place just by being in it. You matter because you're you, and there's no one else like you in the entire world. Florence couldn't speak through her tears. She just pulled him close and held on tight while their family applauded and cheered around them. That night, after everyone had left and they were alone again in their cabin, Xander and Florence lay in bed together. They were both tired from the long day, but it was a good tired, the satisfaction of being surrounded by love. Did you ever imagine, Florence asked softly, that day in San Elizario that we'd end up here, with all of this? No, Xander admitted. I thought I was just saving you from hanging. I didn't know I was saving myself too. We saved each other. Yes, we did. He pulled her closer, and she tucked herself against his side, her head on his shoulder, just as she had thousands of times before. Florence, you matter to me. You've mattered to me every single day for 52 years, and you'll matter to me every day for whatever time we have left. She smiled into the darkness, her heart full. You matter to me too, my love, always and forever. They lay there in the quiet, listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain night, the wind in the pines, the hoot of an owl, the distant cry of a coyote. The same sounds they'd fallen asleep to for decades. And Florence thought about the scared young woman she'd been, crouched behind a water trough with blood on her hands and no hope in her heart. She thought about the mountain man who'd reached down and offered her not just his hand, but his entire life. She thought about the family they'd built, the love they'd shared, the legacy they would leave behind. She'd spent the first 22 years of her life being invisible, being told through word and deed that she didn't matter. But she'd spent the last 52 years being loved, being cherished, being told every single night that she was important. And in the end, that made all the difference. Florence lived to be 83 years old. When she finally passed, it was peacefully in her sleep, with Xander's hand in hers. He was 89 by then, frail but still sharp-minded, still devoted to the woman who'd been his whole world. The family gathered for her funeral, and they laid her to rest on a hill overlooking the valley, where she could watch over the cabin and the land she'd loved so much. Everyone shared stories and memories, celebrating a life well lived and a love that had endured. Xander stood at her grave long after everyone else had left, his hand resting on the simple wooden marker Thomas had carved. You mattered, Florence, he said quietly. God, how you mattered. You still do. You always will. He lived for 2 more years after that, stubborn and determined even as his body failed him. Emma moved into the cabin to care for him, and she would hear him sometimes, late at night, talking to Florence as though she was still there beside him. When Xander finally died, it was on a clear autumn morning. Emma found him in bed, a peaceful expression on his face, his hand stretched out to the empty space beside him where Florence had slept for over 50 years. They buried him next to Florence, and the entire family came to say goodbye. Thomas spoke at the funeral, his voice strong despite his grief. "My father taught me many things," he said. "He taught me how to hunt and track and survive in the wilderness. He taught me about honor and integrity and hard work. But the most important thing he taught me was this: everyone matters. Everyone deserves to know they're important, that they're loved, that they make a difference in the world." He lived that lesson every single day, and because of him, we all know what it means to truly matter to someone. Years turned into decades. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations. It was expanded and modernized slightly, but the core of it remained the same. And on the mantel, in a place of honor, sat a frame containing two things: a faded photograph of a young Xander and Florence on their wedding day in San Elizario, and below it, carved into a piece of wood in Xander's own hand, the words he'd said to her every single night: "You matter. You always mattered. You always will." And every generation of Wilders who lived in that cabin, who grew up in that valley, learned the story of their great-great-grandparents. They learned about the scared young woman who'd thought she was invisible, and the mountain man who'd shown her she was anything but. They learned about a love that had lasted over 50 years, that had built a family and a legacy. And they learned the most important lesson of all, that everyone matters, that everyone deserves to be seen and heard and loved, that the simple act of telling someone they're important can change not just their life, but the lives of everyone who comes after. The story of Xander and Florence Wilder became a legend in the Franklin Mountains, passed down through the family, and to the few neighbors scattered through the high country. It became a story about love and redemption, about finding home in an unexpected place, about the power of being told you matter. And on quiet nights when the wind whistled through the valley just right, some claimed you could still hear it, the low rumble of a man's voice, speaking words of love that had echoed through the years and would continue to echo for generations to come. You matter. You always mattered. You always will. The end.